Dr. Phil Porter. I'm a glacier scientist here at the University of Hertfordshire, and I wanted to talk about some of the research I'm doing in the high Arctic, but also briefly in the Himalayas. And I've called the talk Glaciers and Global Pandemics, Messages to All from the Climate Change Frontline. I take two. My name is Dr. Phil Porter. I'm a glacier scientist here at the University of Hertfordshire. I've worked extensively in the high Arctic, which will be the focus of the first part of this presentation, just talking about some of the research I do there. But perhaps more importantly, some of the profound changes and accelerating changes we're seeing in that region. But I've also worked in the European Alps extensively, Iceland, and also the Himalaya, where we have significant issues looking forward several decades in terms of water resource availability. And so I wanted to discuss this research of rapidly changing environments in the context of the current global coronavirus pandemic, drawing some links between human activities, environmental impacts, diminishment of that environmental impact as a result of lockdown, and linking that in with some of the changes we're seeing in the world's cryosphere. Now, the cryosphere, that part of the planet comprised of snow and ice, and why do glaciers matter? Well, small glaciers in particular are very sensitive indicators of climate change. That's one of the reasons I've worked extensively on smaller Arctic systems over the years. We are seeing profound and accelerated changes in the cryosphere, the high Arctic in particular, the most rapidly warming part of the planet at present, warming at more than double the global average. And of course, where we have land-based ice melting, there are sea level rise implications. But also delivery of sediments and nutrients to nearshore ecosystems, so there are knock-on ramifications which might not at first be immediately obvious. And of course, another key reason why glaciers and indeed ice sheets matter is the reduction in albedo. Essentially, albedo is reflectiveness. All right, so that's fine. Right, good, stop. Take re. My name is Dr. Phil Porter. I'm a glacier scientist here at the University of Hertfordshire, and this presentation is an overview of some of the work I've been doing in the high Arctic recently, looking at rapidly shrinking glaciers, but I wanted to tie this in with some of the improvements in many environmental parameters we've seen as a result of the coronavirus pandemic and lockdown and associated reduction in human impacts on the environment, and make some suggestions and run through some thought experiments in terms of where we go in future years as we progressively emerge from the current lockdown situation caused by the global pandemic. Now, I've been working in the high Arctic for over 25 years, and I've also worked extensively in Iceland, the European Alps, and the Himalayas. More on the Himalayas a bit later, but why glaciers and ice sheets matter? Well, firstly, they are very sensitive indicators of climate change, not just temperature changes, but also changes in precipitation, snowfall being the main nourishment, if you like, of glacial systems. We're also seeing profound and accelerating changes in the globe's cryosphere, so that portion of our planet comprising snow and ice. The Arctic is currently warming at more than double the global average, and as a result we are seeing profound and accelerating changes in those regions, particularly in the last 10 years. Also, of course, land-based ice will contribute to sea level rise, but there are other implications for melting snow and ice, and that is delivery of sediments and nutrients to downstream and nearshore ecosystems. Glaciers and ice sheets also play an important role in regulating the planet's temperature by reflecting shortwave radiation back into space, keeping surfaces cool. So that reflectiveness we refer to as albedo. And put very simply, if we shrink snow and ice coverage, then that reflective albedo effect also lessens with the potential for enhanced surface warming. And finally, and this is not an exhaustive list, there are water resource issues. We have a significant proportion of the world's population dependent directly or indirectly on snow and ice for their water resources, particularly as we move to looking at Asia and the Himalayas, which I'll come on to later in the presentation. Now, the work of a glaciologist is always difficult because we're dealing with complex systems. I'm a glacier hydrologist. That's my specific area of research interest, and what we're concerned with here is essentially predicting how much water will exit from our glacial system and when. Vital for water resource management, particularly under a warming climate, being able to predict how these systems will respond and generate meltwaters under warming is extremely important. Now, the problem we have, of course, is it's relatively easy to measure the inputs to a glacial system, snow being the main input of mass, and obviously energy in the form of radiation being the key driver of melt. It's relatively easy to measure outputs. For our purposes, we're talking about meltwater runoff, that is our water resource. But what's more difficult to ascertain is how the glacier responds to those meltwater inputs, because inside the glacier we have a complex network of pipes, tunnels, caverns, cavities, which will channel meltwater, store meltwater on very different time scales, depending on the time of year, depending on the shape of that network of pipes, tunnels, conduits. And so the internal hydrological system of the glacier is, to all intents and purposes, a black box, a term we use in the geosciences to denote a system where we have limited to no understanding of its functioning. But of course the goal is to be able to predict those outputs from measured inputs, and to do that we've got to try and understand how that black box, how the internal systems of the glacier work. So here we have a weather station in Spitsbergen in the high Arctic on one of our glaciers, measuring energy inputs, measuring mass inputs, but also measuring melt rates. So that's relatively easy. Here also in Spitsbergen, one of our meltwater gauging stations on the output side. So this is our water resource coming away from the glacier, and that's relatively easy to measure. But getting into that black box, rather more problematic. Now, one technique we can use is to inject a fluorescent dye, which is what's happening here, into a surface stream on the ice surface. That dye will eventually find its way into the glacier via a moulin, which is a vertical shaft which drains water during the melt season deep into the glacier, and we can monitor this fluorescent dye coming out in the meltwater stream at the front of the glacier, and the nature of that signal picked up can allow us to interrogate the morphology, the shape and the functioning of that internal hydrological system to a reasonable degree of certainty. Now, I should add that previous slide looks like environmental destruction. I can assure you it's not. It's a fully biodegradable, photodegradable dye, which has no long-term environmental residue. Now, of course, the ultimate means of understanding that black box inside the glacier is to get inside it and to map it and to monitor it. And so I've been involved with a project with colleagues from Aberystwyth University to laser scan the internal hydrological system of the glacier, to look at its shape, which will determine how it functions, how it channels water, but also to look at how it evolves over sequential melt seasons to help us match those inputs to outputs, help us predict the availability of meltwater and its generation. So here is a commercially available laser scanner. This is on the beach in a place called Nyolesund in the high Arctic in Spitsbergen. This photograph incidentally was taken in very early March, so we're at winter-spring transition. We're at sea level to allow us to calibrate the scanner at sea level as a datum. But if you look at the fjord behind my colleague there, you can see it's completely devoid of sea ice, despite the fact we're only just coming out of winter. And that gives you some indication of some of the profound changes we're seeing in this region, because as recently as 10 years ago we'd have seen at least some sea ice in this fjord, and if you go back 20 years, 15 to 20 years, this fjord would have been completely covered at this time of year. So very, very rapid warming. So here we go. Let's get into some crazy field science. This is me gingerly abseiling my way down into a moulin. This would, in the summer melt season, be a cascading waterfall of water coming from the ice surface. But in winter and spring, or at least early spring, it's dry. So we can abseil into it relatively safely. I don't have a good head for heights, so this is me putting a brave face on it. Halfway down the hole, it's about a 50-metre descent, and there we are looking up, and perhaps trying not to focus too long on the huge overhanging block of ice right above my head. A fairly high intensity working environment. And so what we're doing is essentially abseiling into the moulin and then moving along the meltwater channels that move water to the front of the glacier. And this photograph is taken close to the front of the glacier where the meltwater channel emerges into the outside world. You can see daylight filtering in here. And the small checkerboard targets you can see are markers which allow us to join multiple scenes together, because the laser scanner can only collect a certain amount of information in one scan. It is a huge amount of data. We're talking about millions of points, but we need a common reference point between each scan so we can join two or more scans together. And so we have to ensure that one of those checkerboard targets is in view over the course of two scans, so that we can use that as a common reference point to stitch those scans together. Obviously it's pitch black in there when you move away from the front of the glacier, and once you've abseiled into the moulin and moved along the meltwater channels. I jokingly say when I do presentations that more people have walked on the moon than have been this deep inside glaciers. I'm not sure that's true. But it can't be far off, I would imagine. We're about 60 meters down here. Amazing patterns and textures in the ice, which you can clearly see from this photograph, and picked up beautifully with the head torch, which is obviously the means of lighting we have down there at the base of the glacier. And this is a fly-through scan of one of the laser scans. This is from Derry Jones Associates, who were the industrial partners with this project and who supplied the laser scanner. You can see the meandering meltwater channel there and the almost vertical moulin. So we're now descending from the surface down the moulin. You can just make out the three climbing ropes, the abseil ropes in the centre of the image here. You can maybe make out some rucksacks there. And off we go into the meltwater channel. So a really detailed map of its morphology and its shape will dictate how efficiently it channels water. And we need to build that knowledge into our predictive models to enhance their accuracy. The colours incidentally don't mean anything, they're just there to assist with the visualisation, but you can just see some of those checkerboard targets I mentioned earlier to allow us to stitch together the various scenes, and then up we come through the moulin and back out onto the ice surface. Now let's link this to global pandemics then, or at least start to think about the importance of glacial water resources and think about human impacts on the environment and the need to reduce them, as we've very effectively done during the recent months of lockdown. So here's a basic map of the Himalayas and Asia. And what you can see here is that the majority of the major Asian rivers are fed in their upper reaches from snow and ice regions, be it the Greater Himalaya range or indeed the Tibetan Plateau. So the reason I put this slide in is to really just emphasize again the point that we have a sizable proportion of the world's population dependent on snow and ice melt, both for consumption, but also power generation, irrigation, agriculture, livestock rearing, etc. I mean, for example, just considering the population of China, approximately 1.3, 1.4 billion, the population of India, 1 billion, and these rivers fed by snow and ice melt, absolutely fundamental to the freshwater resource for these Asian populations. But also if we move closer to home into Europe, in terms of where the major European rivers rise, we can again see the importance of snow and ice melt. And so really this flags the importance of knowing, or trying to understand, trying to know how glaciers are responding to warming in terms of their melt, but more importantly from a water resource point of view, trying to better predict the future availability of those water resources under a changing climate. And clearly that's the key basis, the core basis for the research we're undertaking in locations such as the high Arctic, to really understand the interior working of those systems so we are better able to predict. Because fresh water is a vital resource. It's not just glacial melt, also snow melt. Snow melt is extremely valuable in mountain and indeed downstream communities, because unlike glacial melt, it tends not to be so laden with silt and sediments. It's very clean, it's very pure, so it can be used, for example, as this picture shows, for clothes washing as well as consumption, irrigation, etc. And in that sense, it's a more valuable resource than the glacial melt, because of that greater purity, that lack of sediment. But of course, snowmelt levels are dwindling in many areas. Now, taking perhaps a more global picture, this is the Hunza Valley in the Karakoram Himalaya. You can see very fertile irrigation terraces here, but this is a very arid region, and that agriculture is only possible because of the supply of snow and ice. Otherwise, agriculture would be extraordinarily difficult. And of course, those rivers feed some of the world's most agriculturally productive zones. And these are areas from which we import foodstuffs. So regional melt in locations such as the Himalayas has global consequences. I'll come back to that point in a moment. One of the impacts we've seen arising from lockdown, one of the positive impacts, is an increase in air quality, decrease in particulate pollution in many areas, and that's quite interesting, because something which is accelerating melt of glaciers in many regions, but particularly in the Himalayas, where we're close to large centres of industry, for example in China and India, is the deposition of dark dusts, black carbon, soot, on the ice surface. Now, we always get natural dusts blowing around ice surfaces. Now, those dusts accelerate surface melt because they are dark, they absorb energy from the sun, and they conduct that energy to help melt the underlying ice. But we're exacerbating this process through the deposition of black carbon, of soot. And so it's very interesting that we've seen this dramatic reduction in particulate pollution in many areas arising from lockdown. And so really that raises the question of, can we move out of lockdown and keep those air quality levels high, those particulate pollution levels low? It's a very interesting question. But back to this being a global issue, why have I put a jar of Marmite on the screen? Well, you will recall the Brexit vote. Immediately after the Brexit vote, the value of the pound dropped. And various news reports about this, obviously, in terms of the increasing price of various staple foodstuffs. And Marmite seemed to hit the headlines. Not quite sure why Marmite in particular, but the price of Marmite went up. and this was reported in the mainstream media because, of course, imported ingredients. And so a question I pose in lectures and in public presentations is, why should we be concerned here in the UK about shrinking Himalayan glaciers several thousand miles away? Well, that snow and ice melt from those shrinking glaciers irrigates some of the world's most productive agricultural zones upon which we all depend for our food supply to a greater or lesser extent. So it's not just a regional problem or a local problem for those mountain areas, those mountain communities and areas downstream fed directly by those rivers. It is a global issue. Now, we can't get away from studying shrinking glaciers and not addressing climate change, and this really is what I want to talk about in relation to the global pandemic, or more accurately the lockdown and the positive environmental impacts that we've seen. Since I started my scientific career back in 1991, the sceptical voices were suggesting that climate change isn't real. It's not happening. The glaciers are not shrinking. This is not being reported correctly, etc. We then moved more recently, probably from the early part of the millennium. Okay, it's real. We're just not convinced it's caused by humans, and there's still political parties in the UK that take this view, accepting climate change is happening, but it's not being caused by human activities. And I think we're probably moving more now into the oops category of, right, we know it's happening, we know it's real, we know we're in no small way to blame through human activities, and we've got to do something about it before we reach the end phase there, which I've blanked out the expletive, which was on this cartoon timeline that I found online. Now, the problem is really one of a big gap, if you like, between discourse and public statements and actual activity on the ground. So the UK Parliament declared a climate and environment emergency. And of course, that's clearly a positive step in many ways, but rather an empty gesture unless real actions are taken. And of course, real actions have now been taken, but not for the reasons we thought. So rather than by policy, it's been by pandemic. And so if we look at this paper that's recently been published in Nature Climate Change, you can see various markers in terms of CO2 emissions and some clear drops in some areas, particularly surface transport, which has shown the biggest drop arising from obviously lockdown and curtailment of travel. So you may have seen news reports along these lines. Daily emissions totals, global daily emissions totals have dropped significantly. In the early April, according to this paper, down 17%, which is remarkable if you think about emissions reductions successes through existing means. But a sobering reminder that only brings us back to equivalent daily emissions, global emissions in 2006. So that just gives you some indication of how much emissions have risen year on year. Now, of course, there is concern about a post-pandemic rebound in emissions. If we look at the global financial crisis, 08-09, there was a drop in emissions, around about 1.4% globally. But that soon ramped immediately back up in 2010 and an increase of 5.1%. So I guess really my message is we're seeing profound and accelerating changes in my area of research interest, the cryosphere. There is a massive upsurge in awareness of the human impact on our natural environment, a massive awareness in climate change, and many, many, many reports of improved environmental parameters as a result of lockdown, not just these CO2 emissions figures, but improvements in water quality, air quality, animal insect populations bouncing back in some areas too. So the question really is, can we move forward from this pandemic and enjoy a healthier a more harmonious relationship with our natural environment, which really is critical for our longer term survival as a species. And there are some great opportunities. I've just picked this one out um, because it's relevant to the area where I live, and it's relevant to many areas in the UK where extensive house building is planned in response to a very real need. There's no denying that at all. The map in the background from Google Earth shows my village of Meppershall with the shaded purple areas indicating proposed developments of just over 300 homes. These are the sorts of opportunities we can actually make the right decisions on now. In the light of the pandemic, as we move out of lockdown, we can make decisions which lock us into a healthier future as far as our relationship with nature is concerned. So if we look at these housing developments at the moment, they're proposed to be constructed using techniques that have changed little over the last 30-40 years. So plasterboard ceilings on the top of the box, as it were, before the roof is put on, and a bunch of glass fibre insulation rolled out on top. This is not advanced energy efficient construction techniques. It's the same techniques we've been using for decades. All these properties will have gas central heating installed, no solar panels, no ground source heat pumps, so no sustainable energy being considered at all at this stage. No investment in public transport infrastructure, complete reliance on the private car. Scant regard given to water resources and the increased demand that will come no matter what water-saving devices are fitted into properties, and no compulsion in England to fit sustainable urban drainage systems. So this is where the land surface is constructed such that rainwater can filter through and soak back into the aquifer from where our water is drawn. So we've got a great opportunity here. We can either make the right decisions and build these much needed houses using the right technologies, taking on board our increased awareness, our increased knowledge of our interaction with the natural environment, the massive improvements we've seen in a very short period because of lockdown. Or we can make the wrong decisions, which is currently what's being proposed in many of these developments across the UK, which effectively locks us into either a high carbon future, gas central heating, poor insulation, etc., or expensive retrofitting down the line. And I think one of the things we need to become more aware of, and I think many of us have during lockdown, is the fact that we are, at the end of the day, just animals, and as animals we rely on our wider ecosystem for our long-term survival as a species. So I've put these images up. This is Chris Packham, who was critical of the I'm a Celebrity programme for them eating insects and the like. Well, whether we like it or not, we are animals, as I've mentioned. We are dependent on those bugs and beasties and creepy crawlies. They're part of our ecosystem, and we depend on that ecosystem for our survival long-term as a species. And I think we've lost sight of that. But it is heartening to see during lockdown just how many people have experienced a greater engagement with and understanding of our natural world. And I think that's a great opportunity to capitalise on and remember as we move out of lockdown. And a couple of thought experiments really for consideration as well as we move out of lockdown and we have this opportunity arising from this terrible pandemic, but we have this opportunity to start changing the way we behave and interact with our natural environment. So let's just consider the dinosaurs. Roamed the earth for approximately 165 million years. Given our current interactions with our environment, given the damage that many of our activities are doing to our environment, I just ask you to consider how many million years you feel the human species will be inhabiting the planet if we don't adopt a more harmonious relationship with our natural ecosystems. Will we live 165 million years? Will we even make it to a million years? That's an interesting question to reflect on as we emerge from lockdown. And finally, looking at the various emissions scenarios, obviously subject to error margins dependent on things such as population growth, development of technology, economic growth, etc. But we often think about the end of the century being a long way away. 6.5 degrees C is the upper projection for the end of the century, and I speak to many people who say, well, that's a long way away. But a final thought experiment really to highlight that it's not that far away, in fact. If we consider myself, I'm aged 50, well 51 actually, but let's keep the maths simple. There's approximately 7.7 billion of us on the planet, and global average temperatures are about 1 degree C warmer than pre-industrial averages. Go to the middle of the century, if I'm lucky enough to make it to 80, approximately 9 billion people, and 1.5 to 2.5 degrees C increase above pre-industrial average temperatures. 2.5 degrees C would start to make life very problematic indeed for us as a species. If I'm lucky enough to get a letter from the Queen and make it to 100, 9 to 10 billion of us on the planet, 3 to 4.5 degrees C. Well, now we are in trouble, particularly at the upper end of that temperature scale. Now, these figures, I should add, are assuming business as usual. And the reason I'm presenting them like this is to present, if you like, a worst case scenario, but to highlight why there is a real compelling need to move out of this lockdown period and adopt a different attitude to our impact on the environment, economic development, etc. So suddenly, as somebody alive today in 2020, getting to 2070, possibly, maybe, if I'm very lucky, well, suddenly the end of the century is looking rather closer. So if we consider a child born today in 2020, the figures are the same as myself, age 50 or 51. We've got 7.7 billion of us on the planet, 1 degree C above pre-industrial average temperatures approximately. But let's just fast forward right to the middle of the century. The person born today, age 30, so only 30. 9 billion of us on the planet, 1.5 to 2.5 degrees C temperature increase. And if we take this to the end of the century, the person born today will be 80 years old. That's a perfectly reasonable lifespan to expect for somebody born today. But the figures are rather sobering. 11 billion of us potentially on the planet, temperatures anywhere between 3.5 and 6.5 degrees C above pre-industrial averages. Well, clearly the upper range of that temperature range is not compatible with society and life as we know it today. And even the lower end of that range is going to make life very difficult for many people and indeed many species and ecosystems. So these are, of course, business as usual worst case scenario figures. And so the reason for going through this thought experiment is just to pause for thought, as many of us have done during lockdown. We have seen a dramatic improvement in many environmental parameters, as I mentioned earlier on. And we have a golden opportunity now to move out of lockdown and develop a more harmonious relationship with our natural environment, such that these worst case scenario figures don't come to pass. They may look distant, but as I hope I've demonstrated here, the end of the century is in fact not that far away, particularly if we consider it in terms of these human lifespans. So I hope that's given some food for thought, and I wish you all the very best as we all move out of lockdown and into a return to some sort of normality, but hopefully a healthier and happier normality in terms of our relationship with the natural environment.